The order had already been signed. That was the part nobody wanted to say out loud, but Okafor knew. She'd read the chart 3 times in the break room, standing in her compression socks, with cold coffee going colder in her hand, reading the same 4 lines over and over like they might change if she looked long enough. Terminal agitation, non-responsive to intervention. Comfort measures only. The attending had initialed it at 11:47 the previous night. By the time Okafor arrived for her overnight shift at Foothills Medical Centre, the man in room 14 had already been moved to the end of the east corridor, where the fluorescents buzzed a little lower and the nurses checked in a little less often. He had no name on his chart, just John Doe, male, approximately 50-60 years, found unresponsive in a parking structure off 16th Avenue NW at 2 a.m. on a Thursday. No wallet, no phone, no identification of any kind. The paramedics who brought him in had noted, almost as an afterthought, that he was wearing a military issue jacket, the kind that hadn't been standard issue in about 15 years, and that his hands, despite the state the rest of him was in, showed the particular kind of callus that only comes from decades of very specific work. Someone who had trained with their hands, someone who had done it for a long time. The neurologist on call had been direct. The hypoxic injury was severe. Even if he came back, and she did not think he would, the window had almost certainly closed. Brain activity was minimal, in her assessment. The family liaison had tried to trace next of kin. There was nothing. No fingerprint match in the civil database. No dental records that came up clean. It was as if the man had simply stopped existing sometime before he stopped breathing. Okafor was 31 years old. She had been a registered nurse for 6 years, the last 3 of them on the neurology ward at Foothills. She was not easily rattled by the realities of her job. She understood better than most people that medicine had limits, and that some of those limits were not cruel. They were simply true. She had held hands at the end of life and meant it. She had called time of death and gone home and fed her cat and watched television, because that was how you survived the job. But something about room 14 sat wrong with her. She couldn't have explained it precisely. It was partly the jacket. It was partly the hands. It was partly the fact that when she did her first check of the evening, just after midnight, and stood at the foot of his bed in the dim light listening to the ventilator count out its mechanical rhythm, the man's face looked less like a stranger's than like someone she ought to recognize. Like a face from a photograph she couldn't place. She told herself it was nothing. She did her checks and wrote her notes and went about the rest of her shift. At 2:43 in the morning, she heard him speak. She was in the hallway outside room 14, updating a different patient's chart on the rolling workstation when the sound came through the partially open door. Not a moan, not the random vocalizations she sometimes heard from patients in altered states, but an actual word. Or something close to a word. She went still. Then she pushed the door open with her shoulder and went inside. He was exactly as she had left him. Supine, intubated, both arms at his sides, the monitoring leads undisturbed on his chest. His eyes were closed. The ventilator cycled. The number on the pulse ox hadn't moved, but she had heard something. She was certain of it. Okafor pulled a chair up to the side of the bed and sat down. This was not, strictly speaking, in the protocol. There was no clinical reason to sit with an unresponsive patient who had been placed on comfort measures. She sat anyway. She watched his face and she waited, and after about 4 minutes she heard it again. It wasn't English. The word, if it was a word, came out in a low, rough exhale, barely audible under the sound of the machines. She leaned forward. She had studied French immersion through high school and retained enough to parse a menu and occasionally embarrass herself in Montreal. What she heard was not French. It had a harder shape to it, shorter vowels, something in the consonant clusters that she almost recognized and then didn't. She took out her phone, against protocol, she was aware, and typed what she thought she'd heard into a search engine, spelled phonetically, because there was no other way. The results came back in a language she hadn't studied. She stared at them for a long moment. Check. The word she had heard was check. She looked it up. It meant hold on. Okafor didn't sleep when her shift ended. She drove home along Crowchild Trail in the gray early morning light, made tea she didn't drink, and sat at her kitchen table looking at nothing in particular. Her cat climbed onto the table and she moved him off. He climbed back. She let him stay. The word itself wasn't what was keeping her up. People murmured in unconsciousness sometimes, fragments of other languages if they'd grown up bilingual, old words from childhood, whatever the brain had archived deepest. It wasn't necessarily significant. What was keeping her up was the jacket. She'd pulled the admission notes again before leaving. The paramedic's description was brief, standard field notation, not much room for detail, but one of them had added a small addendum in the comment field, probably out of habit or curiosity. The jacket had a patch on the inside collar, not a brand tag, a unit identifier. She hadn't caught it on first read. She caught it now. It was a Canadian Forces identifier, a specific one, the kind associated with Joint Task Force 2. Okafor was not a military expert. She did not know the full operational history of JTF-2 or its deployments. She knew what most Canadians knew, that it existed, that it operated in places and ways that were not publicly discussed, and that the people who served in it were not the kind of people whose details turned up easily in any database. She understood, sitting at her kitchen table in the early morning, why no one had been able to identify him. She went back to the hospital at noon. Her shift didn't start until 1900. No one commented on her being there early. Nurses drifted in and out of Foothills at odd hours all the time, picking up forgotten items, completing paperwork, covering for colleagues. She signed herself into the ward and went to room 14. He was still alive. That surprised her, faintly. Not because his condition had changed. It hadn't, not in any measurable way, but because she had half expected the ward to have moved forward without her. That the decision on the chart would have been enacted while she was sitting in her kitchen. It hadn't. He was still there, still breathing with the machine's help, still anonymous. She sat with him again. This time she brought her tablet. She had spent the drive over listening to a language learning application. Basic Czech, the kind designed for travelers, and she had written down 5 phrases in her notebook. She felt faintly ridiculous. She was a neurology nurse, not a linguist. The attending would have had thoughts about this. The charge nurse, Pemberton, who ran the East Corridor with the efficiency and emotional temperature of a functional refrigerator, would definitely have had thoughts. She was alone in the room with him. She spoke quietly. She said, in her approximation of Czech, halting probably wrong in half a dozen ways she didn't know enough to recognize, that she was a nurse, that he was in a hospital, that he was safe. She said it twice. Then she sat back and waited. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then his hand moved. Not much. Just the fingers of his right hand, a slow curling motion against the sheet, like someone reaching for something in a dream. But it was directed. It was deliberate. And when she reached out and placed her hand under his fingers closed around hers and held on. She sat very still. She said in her terrible Czech that she had heard him, that she was listening, that she needed him to keep holding on. His grip tightened, barely perceptibly, and did not let go. What happened over the next 72 hours was, from a clinical standpoint, not easy to explain. His brain activity, which the neurologist had characterized as minimal, began to show a pattern. Slow at first, then with more consistency. The attending neurologist, Dr. Fairweather, was careful in her language about it. She did not use the word miraculous, because she was a scientist and scientists don't, but she did revise her prognosis twice in 3 days, which amounted to the same thing. She increased monitoring. She ordered new imaging. She stopped using the word irreversible without qualifiers. Okafor did not tell anyone about the check. She continued her regular duties on the ward and made no mention of the extra time she was spending in room 14. She was not deceiving anyone, exactly. She was not falsifying documentation or neglecting other patients. She was spending her breaks in a chair beside an unidentified man's hospital bed, speaking badly in a language she barely knew because something told her it was working. She was aware of how this sounded. She was also aware that his grip had been stronger each time. On the 3rd evening, he opened his eyes. They were gray. She noticed that. Not blue-gray, not the faded blue that sometimes looked gray in dim light, but actual gray, the color of Lake Louise in November, flat and still. He looked at the ceiling first, which was expected. Then he looked at the window. Then, slowly his head turned and he looked at her. He could not speak. He was still intubated and would be for another day and a half while they assessed his swallowing function, and the extubation team worked through their protocol. But he looked at her with the kind of focused, deliberate attention that told her, unambiguously, that he was present, that someone was home. She said in Czech and then in English that his name was not known to them yet and that she hoped he could tell them when he was able. She said he was at Foothills Medical Centre in Calgary. She said it was March. He blinked twice, slowly, like a man taking stock of very important information. She said, "You said Thursday when I was in the hall. Hold on, I thought you should know that someone heard you." Something moved in his gray eyes. It wasn't emotion exactly, or it was, but compressed, controlled, the expression of someone who had been trained for a very long time not to show too much. But it was there. She saw it. He didn't look away from her for a long time. His name, when they finally got it, was not the one anyone had been looking for. That was the part that took another week to untangle, and when it did, it came apart in ways that reached considerably beyond Foothills Medical Centre and the East Corridor's quietly buzzing fluorescence. He was able to write before he could speak. Extubation went smoothly and his voice came back in stages. First a raw whisper, then something that functioned as speech. Then, within 48 hours, something that was clearly the remnant of a very particular kind of voice. Calm and precise and accustomed to being listened to. He asked for water. He asked what day it was. He asked whether he had been in the structure alone when they found him. That last question gave Okafor pause. She answered it carefully. She said she didn't know the details of how he was found, only that he had been brought in from a parkade near 16th Avenue. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There were two of us." The name he gave the admissions coordinator, when she finally arrived with her clipboard and her patient manner, was Hadley Brask. He spelled it without being asked. He provided a date of birth and a next of kin contact, a sister living in Lethbridge, and then he stopped and looked at the ceiling and said he needed a moment before he answered any more questions. The admissions coordinator gave him the moment. Okafor, who was finishing a chart at the doorway, saw the expression on his face during that pause. It was not the expression of a man choosing what to share. It was the expression of a man calculating what was safe to share. There was a difference. She had worked in medicine long enough to know it. The sister arrived from Lethbridge the next morning. Her name was Roswin, and she was several years younger than Brask, and she came through the door of room 14 with the particular held-back urgency of someone who had been frightened for a long time and was managing it. She embraced her brother carefully, accounting for the IIV line and the monitoring leads, and then she stood back and looked at him with an expression that told Okafor everything she needed to know about how long she'd been managing it. Roswin asked to speak to those who had sat with him. Someone on the ward had mentioned it, in passing, that one of the overnight nurses had been spending time in room 14, that it had seemed to help. Okafor was paged off her break. She came to the room and found Roswin standing near the window, Brask watching from the bed with those flat gray eyes. Roswin said, "He told me what you did, the check." Okafor started to say that it had been a small thing, a guess. She wasn't sure it had made any clinical difference, but Roswin stopped her with a small head shake. "He served 2 tours with a NATO unit based out of Partibus," Roswin said. "In the Czech Republic, 12 years ago. He was there long enough that he dreamed in Czech for years after. I used to call him on the phone and he'd answer in the wrong language." She paused. "No one here knew that. No one here could have known that." Okafor said, "He spoke first. I just spoke back." Roswin looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "The man he went into that parkade to find, do you know what happened to him?" The question landed in the room like something thrown rather than said. Okafor looked at Brask. Brask was watching the window. "They told me I was alone when I came in," he said quietly. "I need to know if that's true." It wasn't. The second man had been found 12 minutes after Brask in the lower level of the same structure by a transit officer doing his rounds. He was alive, but not by much. 2 stab wounds, one to the flank and one closer to the shoulder, and a head injury consistent with having struck the concrete floor. He had been admitted to emergency at the Peterloo Heed Centre rather than Foothills, which was why the 2 cases had not been connected initially. His chart also read John Doe. He was also unidentified. It took Okafor 3 days to make the connection, and she made it not through any official channel, but because she was paying attention and because the transit officer's report had been filed with the hospital as a matter of protocol and ended up in a stack of administrative documents she was helping to sort. She saw the address, the timestamp, the description of the jacket, a match for the one folded in the evidence bag in Brask's closet, and she understood. She brought it to the charge nurse, Pemberton, who told her it was a matter for security and possibly the police, not for nursing staff. Okafor brought it to the police. The constable she spoke with at the district office on her day off was professional and not unkind and made it clear, without saying so directly, that he was not certain what to do with the information she was presenting. Two unidentified men, found in the same location hours apart, both with military backgrounds, neither of them immediately traceable. He took her notes. He said someone would follow up. Someone did follow up, but not from the district office. The man who came to Foothills 2 days later was not in uniform. He introduced himself as an officer with the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service, and he asked to speak with Braskek. And then, separately and unexpectedly, he asked to speak with Okafor. She met him in a consultation room near the nursing station. He was younger than she expected. He had the same quality Brask had, that compressed, measuring attention, but where Brask's was quiet, this man's was precise in a way that felt clinical. He sat across from her and opened a notepad and asked her to describe, in order, everything she had observed from the night Brask was admitted. She described it. She did not leave anything out. She was a nurse. She understood documentation, and she told him in sequence: the jacket, the unit identifier in the collar, the word in Czech, the response to her speaking, the question about whether he had been found alone. The officer wrote without comment until she finished. Then he asked, "Did he tell you anything about why he was in that structure?" "No." "Did he ask you to look for anything? Pass anything along?" "No." "Did he say anything to you that didn't seem to fit the clinical situation? Anything that struck you as odd?" She thought about this. She thought about the moment. On the second night, when he had been awake but not yet able to speak, when he had reached for the notepad, she kept clipped to her lanyard and written 4 letters on it before she understood what he wanted. She had thought it was a word or the beginning of one. She'd puzzled over it and concluded he was disoriented, still surfacing from the injury, writing fragments. She still had the page folded in the front pocket of her bag because she hadn't known what else to do with it. She took it out. She set it on the table. The officer looked at it. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, the same compression she'd seen in Brask's, but faster, tighter. He asked if he could take the page. She said yes. He put it in his folder. He thanked her and stood and said he might need to follow up. He said she had done the right thing by coming forward. He said it with the practiced neutrality of someone who said things like that frequently, and she believed him anyway, because she thought he meant it. When she returned to the ward, Pemberton was waiting with an expression that could have cured concrete. "The CF-ness," Pemberton said. "On my ward." "I know," Okafor said. "Whatever you've gotten yourself into." "I heard a patient speak," Okafor said. "I listened, that's all." Pemberton looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Charts current?" "Current. Fine," Pemberton said, and went back to her station. The second man's name was Wojciech Slaby. He was Czech, not Canadian, not a Canadian Forces member, but a former member of the 601st Special Forces Group, based out of Prostejov, who had, according to what Brask was eventually willing to say, been in Calgary on a matter that was private and personal and had nothing to do with any current operational mandate. He had been Brask's counterpart on the deployment to Pardubice 12 years earlier. They had kept in contact. When Slaby's daughter had gone missing in transit somewhere between Prague and Vancouver, Slaby had called the one person he still trusted on the Canadian side, and that person had come. That was what had put them both in a parking structure at 2 in the morning. Not an operation, not a sanctioned mission. 2 men trying to find a girl. She was 22. Her name was Carolina, and she had been studying environmental sciences at UBC and had taken a bus to Calgary to visit a friend and had stopped answering her phone 12 days before her father arrived in the country. The friend had not filed a missing persons report. The friend, it would later emerge, was not precisely a friend. Okafor learned all of this in pieces. None of it through official channels, because official channels were not designed to share information with night shift nurses who had stumbled into things by accident. She learned it from Roswin, who learned it from Brask, who told his sister things he did not tell anyone else. She learned part of it from a brief formal visit Brask made to the East Corridor on the day before his discharge, When he stood in the doorway of room 14 in his own clothes for the first time and looked at Okafor with those flat gray eyes and said thank you in a way that meant something more than the words. She said, "Did they find her?" He said, "They found her." She said, "Is she all right?" He said, "She will be." And then, after a pause, there were others. She wasn't the only one. She understood what that meant. She understood the weight of it, the scope of what a missing girl in a parking structure at 2 in the morning could open up if the right people pulled the right thread. She did not ask for details she wasn't meant to have. She was a nurse. She understood what was hers to hold and what wasn't. She said, "The word you said, Doctor say." He said, "I didn't know anyone was there." She said, "I know. I was just passing in the hall." He looked at her. Something in the measured, compressed face shifted, not much, but enough. He said, "You said it back to me." "I did. In very bad Czech. Extremely bad Czech," she agreed. "It was enough," he said. And then, it was more than enough. He left on a Tuesday morning, his sister driving him back down the highway to Lethbridge to recover properly. He did not leave a number or an address. The chart was closed and filed and became part of the hospital's administrative record. Slobby was transferred to a rehabilitation facility after his surgeries and was visited regularly by what the ward clerk at Peterloo Heath described as a rotating cast of very serious men with very careful manners. Carolina Slabby was located in a rental property in the northeast part of the city. She was not alone when they found her. The investigation that followed would eventually involve 3 different law enforcement agencies across 2 countries and produce outcomes that were not made fully public, because outcomes like that rarely are. Pemberton found Okafor in the break room on the last night of the month, sitting with her coffee and her compression socks, looking at nothing. It was past 3 in the morning. The ward was quiet in the way it only got at this hour, a particular quality of stillness that Okafor had come to think of as the hospital's true state. The noise was the performance, and this was what it actually was, underneath. Pemberton poured herself a coffee and sat down across from her without comment. This was unusual. Pemberton did not, as a rule, sit. After a moment, she said, "You wrote patient-reported responsiveness to verbal stimulus in the chart." "He did respond," Okafor said. "That's accurate. The verbal stimulus being." Pemberton said, "Check. That's accurate too." Pemberton looked at her coffee. "I've been charge nurse on this ward for 11 years, she said. "In 11 years, I have never had the CFNIS in my corridor. It won't happen again," Okafor said. "Probably." Pemberton made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "The clinical documentation is clean?" "Clean. And the young woman, she's going to be all right," Okafor said, "from what I understand." Pemberton nodded slowly. She drank her coffee. The ventilator in the room at the end of the hall counted out its slow rhythm. Outside, Calgary was doing what it did at the end of March. Trying to decide between winter and something else, the 2 states coexisting uneasily in the dark. "I heard you. The night you were in there with him," Pemberton said, speaking. Through the door. Okafor looked at her. "I didn't come in," Pemberton said. "I thought about it." She paused. "I decided you knew what you were doing." Okafor said nothing for a moment. Then, "I didn't, really. I just had a feeling." "That's most of this job," Pemberton said. She stood, rinsed her mug, set it back on the shelf. She paused at the door. "You're in next Thursday," she said. "East Corridor again." "Room assignments are posted." "I know," Okafor said. "Good," Pemberton said, and left. Okafor sat alone in the break room for a while longer. She thought about a word she had typed into a search engine at 3 in the morning, phonetically spelled, not knowing if it was real. She thought about fingers closing around her hand in the dark. She thought about a young woman named Carolina who had taken a bus to Calgary on an ordinary Tuesday and had been 3 days, maybe 4, from disappearing entirely, and hadn't, because a man in a parkade had murmured a word in the wrong language, and the right person had been passing in the hall. There was no version of this story that made sense if you told it straight. There was no protocol that accounted for it, no documentation field where she could have written. "I sat with a stranger because his face looked like someone I was supposed to know. I spoke badly in a language I don't speak." He held on. She finished her coffee. She rinsed her mug. She went back to the ward. Room 14 was empty now, newly cleaned, ready for whoever came next. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the bed, the window, the lamp left on at its lowest setting. Then she moved on down the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the rooms where patients breathed and dreamed, and held on in ways they would never fully understand. She had 4 more hours on shift. She would be back on Thursday. There was always another room. There was always another chart, another name someone didn't know yet, another voice saying something in the wrong language, in the wrong direction, waiting for someone to understand it. She picked up her next chart and went to work.